When Ellie Monroe inherited a rusted metal shed on the edge of a decommissioned World War II airfield, she expected dust, cobwebs, and maybe a few bird nests. What she didn't expect was the hulking shadow of a P-38 Lightning fighter still intact, still sealed behind corroded doors, and still carrying secrets in its cockpit. As she wiped decades of grime from the fuselage, something about the plane felt unfinished, like it had been waiting for someone. And when the propeller shifted just barely, the hair on her arm stood up. This wasn't just restoration, it was resurrection. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode has a discovery even deeper beneath the surface, and trust us, you won't want to miss it. The letter from the lawyer was short, a name she didn't recognize, a property she never knew existed, and instructions to retrieve keys in person. Ellie Monroe stared at the paper in her hand. The name Henry Monroe stamped neatly at the top. Her grandfather. She barely remembered him, just an old man in oil-stained overalls and hands that smelled like steel wool and gasoline. He died when she was 6. Her father never talked about him, just called him complicated. Still, here she was, 27 years old, driving 2 hours out of Portland, with a rusted lockbox on her passenger seat and questions rattling louder than the toolbox in her truck bed. The shed was worse than she expected. The roof sagged like it had given up years ago, and ivy curled around the gutters like a noose. It sat at the edge of what used to be a World War II airfield, now just open scrubland and broken concrete. A chain-link fence, half swallowed by weeds, wrapped around the back. Ellie parked, pulled on her gloves, and stepped into the dust. The key stuck in the padlock. Typical. She jiggled it, muttered a curse, then finally heard the clunk of rusted metal surrendering. When the doors creaked open, the smell hit her, not just must and age, but something electric beneath it. Old oil, burned rubber, and maybe, just maybe, ozone, light, spilled through the broken windows above, casting long lines across the floor. And there, in the middle of the hangar, hidden beneath decades of silence and a heavy canvas tarp, was something massive. She pulled the cover back slowly, one breath at a time, until gleaming silver metal peeked out. A wingtip, a faded star and bar emblem. Her heart stuttered. It wasn't just any plane. It was a Lockheed P-38, Lightning twin engines, long nose, iconic booms, World War II legend. And somehow, it looked almost ready. "Holy hell," she whispered, backing up slowly. "What are you doing here?" The tires were flat, the propellers were frozen, but the canopy was closed tight, the cockpit sealed like a time capsule. Ellie circled it once, her boots scuffing dust off the concrete floor. Her hand reached out involuntary, reverent, and touched the cold aluminum skin. That's when she heard it. A soft click, a faint mechanical hum, and a single light, deep inside the right nacelle, flickered on like the plane had just taken its first breath in 80 years. Ellie stumbled back, pulse thudding. It was impossible. There was no power, no connection, no explanation, but something about the way that light blinked slow, then steady, felt less like a glitch and more like a greeting. She looked around the hangar again, suddenly seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't a forgotten shed. This was a waiting room. And something inside that plane was still alive. Ellie didn't sleep that night. She sat on the motel bed with the old key still clutched in her palm, replaying the moment over and over. The hum, the light, the way the plane seemed to notice her. It had been almost 12 hours since she stepped into that forgotten hangar, and her hands still smelled faintly of oil and oxidized metal. She should have been exhausted, but her body thrummed with something she hadn't felt in years: curiosity, wonder, maybe even awe. The next morning, she was back before sunrise. A thin layer of mist hung over the field as she pushed open the hangar doors again. The air inside was cooler now, still heavy with dust, but different somehow. Less like abandonment, more like anticipation. She walked straight to the nose of the plane. The light from the night before was off, but when she placed her hand against the panel again, she could still feel the warmth where it had been. Not hot, just the kind of lingering warmth a machine gives off after it's been working. Except this plane hadn't moved in decades. No fuel, no battery, no reason. Ellie backed up and took it in from a distance. The fuselage was remarkably intact, dull silver with streaks of oxidation, but no major damage. The markings were faded but still legible. LT. H. Monroe. Painted in crisp military stencil under the cockpit. Her grandfather. She stared at the name for a long time, blinking through the fog of memory. She didn't know much about his military service, just an old photo or two, and her father's silence. But seeing his name there, ghosted in paint and time, it hit her in the chest like a delayed echo. She climbed up slowly, boots scraping against the side rail. The canopy resisted her first pull, but then shifted with a metallic groan, reluctant, but not locked. Inside, the cockpit was a museum. Dust on every surface, dials frozen mid-life. A faded flight manual sat open on the seat, pages curled like petals. Ellie leaned in and saw something tucked beneath it, a folded slip of waxed paper with faint handwriting still legible after all these years. If you're reading this, you're not here by accident. Her breath caught. She unfolded the rest. This plane's last mission never left the ground. I gave my word I'd finish it, never did. If you found her, you might be the one who can. Keep her grounded if you must, but don't let her be forgotten. Not like me. It wasn't signed, but she didn't need a signature. She looked around the cockpit again, not just at the controls, but at the choices. The switches labeled by hand, the seat reinforced with custom brackets, the faint smell of tobacco and leather that still clung to the air. This wasn't just a warbird. It was a workshop, a final project, a promise. Ellie slid back down and stood in front of the plane like it might speak. Maybe it already had. She pulled out her phone, opened her notes app, and typed 3 words. Mission, restore lightning. The moment she hit save, she heard it again. That faint click, that same light, and this time, she didn't flinch. She stepped toward the propeller and whispered, "All right, old man, I'll finish what you started." And the plane, impossibly, seemed to listen. By the 3rd visit, Ellie had brought tools. Not many, just a flashlight, a wrench set, and her father's old voltmeter. The same one he used to teach her how to wire her first go-kart, back when she was 9, and he still smiled once in a while. She hadn't touched it in years. But something about the P-38 made her want to try again. The hangar was silent as she unlocked it, the early morning sun casting golden slats across the floor. Dust motes drifted through the beams like ash suspended mid-fall. The plane looked the same as yesterday. Still waiting. But when she approached the engine nacelle, the right one, where the strange flickering light had appeared, her stomach dropped. The panel was open, not fully, just a hair. As if something inside had shifted. Ellie froze. "Hello?" she called out, scanning the hangar. No response, no footprints but her own. Still, she stepped back cautiously and circled the aircraft once, checking for signs of tampering. Nothing. No broken locks, no missing tools, no animals. Just the strange, uncanny sense that the plane was responding. She swallowed and approached again. This time, she crouched down and ran her fingers along the edge of the open panel. The metal was warm. Not sun-warmed, it was still early, but engine-warm. Like it had been working, or trying to. Inside was a narrow compartment. Wires, tubes, and behind them, tucked in shadow, a bulb about the size of a marble. It blinked once as she leaned closer. A soft pulse. Then another. "Okay. That's not normal," she muttered, grabbing the voltmeter from her bag. She clamped the leads onto a nearby terminal carefully, gently, and the screen blinked to life. Her brow furrowed. It was drawing power. Small amounts, barely measurable, but consistent. She checked again. No external source. No batteries, no solar panels. Just a dead aircraft that refused to act like one. She reached into the compartment and gently traced the wire connected to the bulb. It led deeper inside, into a harness that disappeared beneath a row of panels. It was almost like the light had been wired intentionally, not as part of the original avionics, but added later. A modification. A signal, maybe? Ellie leaned back and stared at the thing, half expecting it to blink in Morse code. And that's when she realized. The blink was patterned. 3 short flashes. 1 pause. 2 long. She blinked. Is that an H? She pulled out her phone and Googled Morse. Sure enough, it matched. H, the first letter of Henry, her grandfather. She sat down hard on the hangar floor, the chill of it grounding her spinning thoughts. What was this? Some kind of embedded system? A memory trigger? An unfinished failsafe? Or was it just a malfunction in an old warbird? But it didn't feel like a malfunction. It felt like a message, a heartbeat. She stood, brushed off her jeans, and walked back to her truck. She'd need more tools, schematic prints, maybe even the old maintenance manual she swore she'd never dig through again. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't electrical. It was personal, and she wasn't backing off. The old military service manual arrived 3 days later, a scanned PDF from a collector's forum in Ohio, full of outdated diagrams and smudged operator notes. Ellie had to print it on the shop's busted laser printer, each page curling slightly as it slid out, leaving faint lines of toner like ghost trails across the paper. She spread them out across a folding table she dragged into the hangar and began comparing every inch of the P-38's wiring to what was in the blueprints. Most of it lined up, but not all. Because tucked deep inside the starboard nacelle, where she'd first found the blinking light, was a bundle of cables that didn't belong. Thinner gauge, different color coding, not standard issue. And none of it appeared on the original diagrams. Someone had added this, years after the war. She traced it slowly, carefully peeling back old insulation until the wires disappeared into a narrow conduit leading toward the cockpit. That's when she noticed something even stranger. Etched into the inside of one access panel beneath where the added wires had been zip-tied was a name. Not a full one, just initials. H, M, and under them, in barely visible pencil marks, were numbers. A date? A code? She snapped a photo and kept going. The cockpit revealed more of the same. Wires that looked hand-soldered. A switch on the lower console that didn't match any in the schematic old, oxidized, but still firm to the touch. Beside it, tucked behind a rusted bracket, was a greasy scrap of paper folded like a fortune. She unfolded it slowly. Don't pull power unless you're ready. Once it starts, you finish it. Her stomach twisted. She sat in the pilot's seat, suddenly unsure what she was even restoring anymore. This wasn't just a plane. It had become a message board, a coded journal, a final test. And for all her bravado, she wasn't sure she was qualified to read it. She took a deep breath and rested her hands on the yoke. The leather was cracked, but familiar. It reminded her of her dad's workshop, the way tools seemed to shape themselves to the people who used them. The yoke wasn't just mechanical anymore. It was personal. She looked over at the grease-stained note again and thought about the kind of person who would leave behind such a warning. Someone who planned for this moment. Someone who knew someone else would come. Someone like her? Maybe. Ellie climbed out of the cockpit and grabbed her flashlight. She worked for hours that day, checking every wire, tightening every bolt, scrubbing each instrument panel with care. At one point, she found herself whispering under her breath, not to herself, but to the plane. I'm listening. Just tell me what you want me to see. And when she slid open a lower storage panel, as if on cue, a small cigar box tumbled out. Dusty. Sealed. Heavy. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. This plane hadn't just been hidden. It had been prepared. And she had just found the next piece of the puzzle. Ellie didn't open it right away. The cigar box sat on the workbench like a relic not just of time, but of intent. Its once glossy finish was dulled by years of dust and oil, the edges softened by calloused hands. A faded tax stamp was still affixed to the corner, and someone, likely her grandfather, had carved the initials HM into the lid with something sharp. Maybe a knife. Maybe the same screwdriver now tucked into her back pocket. She stared at it for a while, the silence in the hangar pressing in like a held breath. And then, slowly, she unlatched the brass clasp and lifted the lid. The scent hit her first: old tobacco, metal, and something faintly sweet, like cedar and thyme. Inside, everything had been packed with the precision of someone who expected to be gone a long time. There were photographs, dozens of them, all black and white, curling at the corners. Some of the P-38 flight, others of it half disassembled in this very hangar. Ellie recognized the tools on the floor in one image, the same ones still rusting in the corner now. A few photos showed her grandfather, much younger, smiling beside the plane with a clipboard in hand. He looked taller in the photos, prouder, sharper around the eyes. And then, folded beneath the photos, were the real treasures: blueprints. Hand-drawn, annotated, layered with measurements and scribbled notes in a quick, mechanical scrawl. These weren't general maintenance documents, these were modifications. Custom work, rewiring, reinforced panels, a completely redesigned instrument cluster, unlike anything she'd ever seen in a warbird restoration. Each page was marked with a date, and all of them ended abruptly. Sometime in 1972. She kept going. Beneath the schematics was a letter, not addressed, just titled "Contingency Flight," in all caps. It had been typed on an old typewriter. The ink faded and uneven. If this is found, the lightning remains. She is fully functional pending power and prop sequence. Mission protocols remain classified. Do not attempt activation unless prepared for atmospheric load testing and radio intercept capabilities. Coordinates remain encrypted. Run-up checklist included in final folder. Ellie read it twice, then a third time. The language was sterile, military. But the intent underneath was something else. Urgent, purposeful. She flipped to the final item, a manila folder labeled J-Trail Final. Inside was a checklist, a map with most of the information redacted, and a tiny square of film undeveloped. She turned it over in her hands. This wasn't just restoration anymore. This was research. This was legacy. Maybe even buried history. She laid the blueprints out on the table beside her tools and took a step back. What the hell had her grandfather been building out here, decades after the war? And why had no one ever spoken of it? The quiet in the hangar now felt different. Not stillness, but waiting, like the plane was holding its breath for the first time in 50 years. She grabbed a pencil and began sketching notes in the margins of the blueprints. If this was going to fly again, whatever this truly was, she'd need to do more than tighten bolts and polish chrome. She'd need to finish the design, and maybe, just maybe, uncover a mission never meant to be erased. Ellie drove straight to the county records office the next morning. The night before, she'd stayed in the hangar until well past midnight. Blueprint paper spread across the concrete like a patchwork quilt of questions. Every note in her grandfather's handwriting hinted at something more than hobby or nostalgia. It wasn't restoration, it was construction. A project, maybe even a mission. But she needed answers. And the plane, for all its blinking lights and buried letters, could only whisper so much. The clerk behind the desk was polite, but disinterested. Ellie handed over her grandfather's name, approximate service dates, and a photocopy of the original land deed for the airfield property. The woman disappeared behind a set of swinging file cabinets, and Ellie waited under buzzing fluorescent lights that made her feel like a ghost in someone else's history. When the clerk returned, she had two folders, one for Henry Monroe, one labeled Federal Inquiry, redacted. That got Ellie's full attention. She opened the first folder slowly. It was thin. Just a couple of yellowed pages. Discharge papers from 1000, 946, a commendation for service in aircraft maintenance, and one odd note at the bottom of the final page. Voluntarily reassigned. Civilian Flight Engineering Program, B, Field 12. Clearance level, conditional. She'd never heard of B Field 12. Neither had the clerk. The second folder was even stranger. Most of it was blacked out. A report with no title. A paragraph about unauthorized airframe modifications. A note about non-military flight objectives. And at the very bottom, a handwritten tag. No remains recovered. Presumed deceased. Status pending. Ellie's stomach turned. Her grandfather had disappeared? She flipped the folder shut and stared at the stamp on the front. Closed. 1,970. 3. That matched the last date on his blueprints. The date his plans abruptly stopped. She left the building feeling like the pavement under her boots had shifted. All her life, she'd been told he died in his sleep. Quietly. Peacefully. Now she wasn't so sure he died at all, at least not in the way they said. Back at the hangar, she stared at the plane with new eyes. If he'd vanished, maybe this aircraft had been part of it. Maybe that last mission, the contingency flight, wasn't just a draft. Maybe it had been attempted, failed, or interrupted. She climbed into the cockpit again. The leather seat groaned under her weight. Dust coated the dials, but the switch, the strange one she'd noticed before, was clean, almost like it had been used more recently than everything else. She flipped it. Nothing happened, but something had changed. Underneath the seat, a soft mechanical click echoed. Ellie knelt down and pried up the side panel. Inside was another note, folded neatly. This one wasn't typed. It was written in hurried, smudged ink. If you're here, then I didn't make it. But that doesn't mean it ends. She still works. She just needs someone who listens. Finish what I couldn't. Bring her back. No signature. No name. Just that same looping handwriting. Her grandfather's. Ellie stared at the note, fingers tightening around its edges. He hadn't died in a hospital bed. He died building this, or disappeared trying to fly it. And now, after all these years, the lightning was speaking again and waiting for someone to finish what had been left behind. Word started to spread not from Ellie, but from the old man at the salvage yard down the road. She'd stopped by his lot one afternoon to see if he had any oxygen lines or leftover fuel filters that might fit the lightning. He didn't, but he recognized the part in her hand. "That's P-38 hardware," he muttered, squinting through grease-smeared glasses. "Haven't seen one of those since I was a kid." Ellie nodded, hesitant. "You know anyone who's worked on one?" The man whistled through his teeth. "Not in this town. But I'll tell you what, you keep poking around that old hangar. Someone's bound to show up. People remember more than they admit." She didn't think much of it until they started arriving. First was a retired avionics specialist named Walter, who'd worked for Lockheed in the 72nds. He brought her coffee and a full schematic for a different P-38 variant, just in case. Then came Annie, a former Navy mechanic, who said she used to date one of the Monroe boys back in the day. She didn't remember Henry well, but she remembered the look he used to get when he talked about the project. He used to say, she told Ellie, wiping grease from her hands, that the lightning wasn't meant to just remember the past. It was meant to carry something forward. Ellie didn't know what that meant, but she started listening closer. She cleaned the cockpit until it gleamed. Replaced the cracked yoke padding with stitched leather she shaped by hand. Restored the radio housing even though she had no idea what it would pick up, if anything. She followed the plans in the cigar box religiously. Every page, every bolt, every strange little tweak he'd made. The modifications were bizarre in places, like he'd been trying to make the plane lighter, faster, more responsive than anything its size should have allowed. But she trusted the process. And then came the runway. Behind the hangar stretched a forgotten piece of land-cracked tarmac swallowed by weeds and wind-blown dirt. Ellie stood at its edge one afternoon, blueprint in one hand, the other shielding her eyes against the Sunday. It was long enough, barely, but with some work. She rented a grader from the county, leveled the ground, cleared the brush, volunteers showed up. People from town who had no reason to care except curiosity, or pride, or maybe just a need to believe in something again. A dozen of them worked side by side for weeks, scraping back time. By the end of the month, the lightning stood outside under open sky for the first time in 50 years. Its nose pointed down the newly reborn strip of concrete, engines still silent, propellers still frozen, but it looked like it belonged, like it remembered. Ellie stood beside it, hand on the fuselage, heart in her throat. This wasn't just restoration. This was readiness. The plane wasn't waiting to be admired. It was waiting to fly. The day the propeller moved, no one spoke for almost a full minute. It had been a cold morning. Ellie arrived before sunrise, breath fogging in the air as she unlocked the hangar and wheeled open the double doors. The Lightning stood on the edge of the cracked runway, bathed in soft light, its aluminum skin catching hints of gold as the sun climbed. She approached it like a ritual, checking the tie-downs, brushing away the leaves that had collected along the wing root, and running her fingers along the same edge she always did. The skin was cool, familiar, comforting. Walter showed up with a new voltage tester and a grin. "Brought coffee," he said. "And a crazy idea." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "You finally figured out what that auxiliary circuit is for?" "Not exactly. But I think I know how to wake her up." He handed her a jumper cable. Not from a car. From an old auxiliary ground unit, the kind used on military planes in the 50 seconds to simulate battery ignition without draining internal power. "I've got a portable GPU in the back of my truck," he said. "If we wire her just right, maybe she'll talk back." She hesitated. "It could fry everything," he shrugged. "Or we find out what she's still holding on to." They took their time. Walter on the cables, Ellie on the ignition switch. Annie walked over with a box of donuts and stayed to watch. Then Leo, the teenager who'd started hanging around the hangar on weekends, arrived and sat cross-legged on the tarmac with a sketch pad, quietly drawing the plane like it was a living thing. By the time they were ready, the small crowd had grown to 10 or 12 people. All waiting, all silent. Ellie climbed into the cockpit and sat with her hand on the yoke. The checklist her grandfather left was folded in her jacket pocket. She'd memorized it by now, not just the technical parts, but the phrasing, the tone, as if he'd written it less for a pilot and more for a daughter he'd never gotten to teach. She flipped the first switch, then the next, then reached for the custom one, the oddball wired into the side of the panel, the one that didn't belong in any P-38 schematic but had somehow become the center of everything. She held her breath and flipped it. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a low whine, the faintest vibration under her seat, and one of the twin propellers shuddered. Just once. A hiccup, a twitch, but it moved. Ellie looked out the canopy and saw Walter grinning like he'd just seen a ghost. "She's got power," he called. "At least enough to remember how." Cheers broke out. Light, scattered, hesitant like no one was sure they were allowed to believe it yet. But Ellie sat in the cockpit and smiled, because she knew this wasn't luck. This was preparation meeting the right moment. The Lightning wasn't dead. She had just been waiting for the right hands. And now, piece by piece, bolt by bolt, moment by moment, she was waking up. Ellie had grown used to surprises from the Lightning panels opening on their own, wires rerouted, old lights flickering to life like memory had current. But she hadn't expected the radio to work. Not after all this time. She found it while checking the final diagnostics after the propeller test. A small toggle hidden beneath the main console, right where the flight manual had mentioned an auxiliary comms system in later model P-38 seconds. But this wasn't factory standard. The wires were newer than the rest of the plane, still old, but not 1,940 seconds old. The mount looked modified. And the transceiver unit? It had been swapped entirely for something post-war. She flipped the toggle. The radio popped once. Then static filled the cockpit, thin and ghostly. Ellie adjusted the frequency dial, surprised when the backlight kicked on in a low amber glow. Most of the spectrum was dead blank hiss, occasional hums. But then, around 17.9 megahertzes, something pulsed. Click. Click, click. Click. She froze. It repeated. 3 short. 3 long. 3 short. Ahs, O. S. Her heart pounded. She turned the volume down low, thinking maybe it was interference bleed from some military band. Maybe a ship out on the Pacific. But no. The signal was too clean, too deliberate. Then the pattern changed. Click, 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 click. Long click. Pause. She scrambled for her phone, opened a Morse decoder. H. M. Henry Monroe. Another message. Same pace. No T. D. O. N. E. Ellie sat perfectly still. The cockpit was quiet except for the soft crackle of static and the rhythmic beeping of a man long gone trying to leave a trail. Walter climbed the ladder outside and tapped on the glass. Everything okay? She nodded slowly, then motioned him in. You need to hear this. They listened, together. The repeating sequence. The simplicity of it. No encryption, no military code, just words. A name, a plea, a final instruction. Walter ran a hand over his face. He wired a signal into the radio? He asked, half in disbelief. Not just any signal, Ellie whispered. It's looping. Constant. Probably been going off every time the plane powered up, waiting for someone to decode it. They sat in silence. Outside, the others packed up tools, laughed over coffee, unaware that inside the cockpit, history was whispering from beyond the veil. Ellie shut the radio off, fingers trembling. This wasn't just a message. It was a hand reaching through time. She looked over at Walter. We're not just fixing a plane. No, he agreed. We're unlocking a story. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. She stayed in the hangar alone, light overhead buzzing as she stared at the flight plan tucked inside the cigar box. There were coordinates marked on the edge of the map, barely legible. She'd written them down earlier, intending to look them up. She did now. A patch of uninhabited forest. Remote. Unremarkable. But maybe that was the point. She leaned back in the cockpit, the Morse still echoing in her ears. HM. Not done. And she whispered, to no one, to everything. I hear you. The morning she taxied the Lightning into position, the air was still. No wind, no birds. Just the quiet hush of a town holding its breath. Ellie stood at the edge of the restored runway. Flight jacket zipped to her chin, the checklist folded into her back pocket one final time. She wasn't dressed like a pilot. No flight suit, no helmet, just old jeans, scuffed boots, and a fire in her chest that wouldn't let go. Walter and Annie flanked the plane. Leo stood by the hangar, camera in hand, wide-eyed and silent. Half the town had come. Some brought lawn chairs. Others just stood, coffee cups in hand, hands shoved in coat pockets. No one said much. They didn't need to. This wasn't a performance. It was a resurrection. Ellie climbed into the cockpit and closed the canopy behind her. Everything was ready as it could be. She'd gone over every wire, every bolt, every forgotten corner of her grandfather's design. The ignition hummed beneath her fingertips. The modified radio clicked on automatically, and again, the Morse tapped its quiet rhythm. HMNOTDONE. She whispered back as if the Lightning could hear her. We are now. The props spun slowly at first, groaning against time. Then faster, smoother. The engines coughed once, then caught. The roar echoed across the field like thunder waking up. She eased the throttle forward, guiding the twin-engine Legend down the narrow stretch of concrete like it was born to move. The wheels rumbled, then lifted. Not all at once, gently, almost shy. And suddenly, she was airborne. The town grew smaller beneath her, a cluster of rooftops and blinking headlights. The clouds opened ahead, soft and gold-edged in the rising Sunday. The Lightning cut through the sky like it remembered every turn, every climb, every dream it was once built for. The controls were smooth, responsive, alive. Ellie laughed. Not because it was easy, it wasn't, but because she felt it. Not just the flight, the presence of him, her grandfather. She banked once, slow and graceful, over the edge of the forest where the redacted coordinates had pointed. She didn't land. Not yet, but she circled, once, like a salute, and in her headset, just as the signal faded out, the radio clicked softly, and she swore she heard it. Thank you. By the time she landed, the tears on her cheeks had dried in the wind. She climbed out of the cockpit to cheers and camera flashes, but all she saw was the sun glinting off polished aluminum and the soft, reverent faces of the people who helped her get here. Annie, Walter, Leo, and the memory of a man who had waited half a century for someone to finish the work. Ellie placed a hand on the lightning's warm skin. She remembers, she said softly. And in a way, so would they all. Because some legacies don't live in museums or textbooks. They live in engines, rebuilt by stubborn hands. In runways, cleared by belief. In skies wide enough to hold grief and hope at the same time. The lightning had flown again, and with her, so had Ellie.